Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. And this is Easter, the Universal Festival of Resurrection by Manly P. Hall. An article taken from PRS Journal, Volume 19, Number 4, Spring 1960. Easter, the Universal Festival of Resurrection by Manly P. Hall. To the student of comparative religion, the Easter festival is a marvelous example of the essential unity of human faith and beliefs. The more thoughtful we become, the more certainly we realize how religions have inspired each other and how the symbolism of one drifts into the practices of another until under various names we celebrate identical principles or parallel events. A wholesome example of this interchange of basic ideas is found in the word Easter itself. There is now general agreement among even the most orthodox Christian texts that Easter is derived from the name of the old Teutonic goddess of spring. Her name, Ostara or Istra, was especially familiar to the Saxons and the Anglians, with whom her worship gained firmer ground than in Germany. The Venerable Bede writes at some length on this point, but most Christian historians have been unable to trace the worship of Ostara or her place in the mythology of the Teutons or Saxons. Ostara may have kinship with Vena, the Slavic goddess of spring, and she may be traceable also to an ancient East Indian divinity. In any event, her season was one of rejoicing for the restoration of the year and the bursting forth of vegetation from the earth following the vernal equinox. It is now assumed from adequate documentation that early Christian missionaries and evangelists found it convenient, probably necessary, to permit the non-Christian peoples they converted to retain customs which they had long practiced with reverence and regard. Wherever possible, therefore, Christian festivals became, at least outwardly, the perpetuations of the older celebrations. Thus, the Feast of Ostara was brought into conformity with the holy day of the resurrection of Christ, and the customs of building fires, offering sacrifices, and giving thanks for deliverance from the coldness and barrenness of winter were condoned, if not approved. Natural phenomena have always contributed to the religious calendars of civilized nations. It would seem, for example, that the migrations of birds influenced spring festivals. Old works mention the coming of the swallows, whose amazing regularity of appearance is still recorded in California in connection with the mission of San Juan Capistrano. Birds signal the opening of the year, which was properly figured from the vernal equinox. Obviously, these birds appeared at somewhat different times in various degrees of north latitude. In the course of ages, however, the festivals became fixed, but always near to these natural events. The awakening of hibernating animals, the bursting of green sprouts from the earth, and the budding of trees were all causes for seasonal rejoicing. In Egypt, the deity Osiris was occasionally represented as a mummified figure from whose body green plants were growing, and the deity Serapis, according to Father Kircher, was represented with his body composed of living and growing creatures. Everywhere, the annual restoration of life was considered not only as a visible manifestation of the promise of God that all things should be fruitful and multiply, but also as an annual covenant that death shall not attain victory in the life of nature or in the soul of man. Astronomy was one of the oldest sciences to be cultivated in the search for knowledge and understanding of the mysteries of the universe. 4 seasons came to be known by the dwellers in northern regions. These were spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Each of these seasons was ushered in by the annual motion of the sun. Spring by the vernal equinox, summer by the summer solstice, autumn by the fall equinox, and winter by the winter solstice. In our calendar, these divisions of the year occur on March 20th, June 20th, September 20th, and December 20th, or near those dates. Festivals associated with the vernal equinox welcomed the fertility of the new year. Those at the summer solstice rejoiced over the flowering of life and the promise of the future. At the autumnal equinox came the time of harvesting, the gathering in of the crops, and a general spirit of thanksgiving. The winter solstice corresponded with the lowest point of life and vitality. Men were dependent upon their earlier harvesting for survival, and it seemed that for 3 days the sun stood still, wavering in its course. At this season, man felt the burden of his own sins. Had he broken faith with the laws of God and nature? Had he failed to make due sacrifice? Or had he committed some evil in his heart which might deny to him the blessed return of the sun? There were days and nights of watching, of beseeching, and of universal anxiety. The ancient priests consulted their old books, and the astronomers in their rocky towers watched the heavens for a sign that the sun would be gracious and forgiving. Then came the glad tidings. The new sun had been born. Darkness would not prevail. The great orb of light was again moving northward, and in its triumphal procession would again in due time bring the blessing of the equinox. The celebrated French antiquarian and scholar Court de Gebelin, in his religious history of the calendar, points out that among most ancient peoples the feast of the new year was celebrated at the vernal equinox. He believed the early Christians divided this celebration and removed the new year to the winter solstice. In so doing, they separated symbols and rituals originally relating to one occasion, assigning some of them to the Christmas season and retaining others for the Easter festival. As Oriental peoples generally followed the early custom of beginning the new year in the spring season of fertility, their celebrations of the new year coincide with the Christian festival of Easter. The advent of spring was universally heralded with special rites indicative of rejoicing over the approaching period of fertility and resurrection. Among Chinese observances was thankfulness for the victory of the yang, or positive principle, over the yin, or negative principle. This was accompanied by special solicitations for the souls of the dead and pilgrimages to family graves. Cultures originating in the ancient Hindu system, including Buddhism, also honored the annual revival of nature with feasting, fasting, and pilgrimage. In each case, the visual phenomena of the season established the dating, but the rebirth of the solar deity was recognized, at least symbolically. The recent tendency to standardize the world calendar will probably reveal, in due course, the equinoctial pattern in the religions of mankind. By degrees, rites and rituals became so associated with certain historical events and occurrences that the old astronomical mystery was virtually forgotten. By this late date, however, the festivals themselves were so well established that they continue with other explanations. We might say that many different factors, astronomical, philosophical, religious, and psychological, sustained the older concepts. The feast days and the fast days were handed down as a heritage from one generation to another. In thoughtful periods, they were studied with understanding, but when superficial concerns became paramount, the inner vision was neglected. The festivals might have languished, except for two important factors. First and foremost, men wanted to worship. They had a deep and continuing desire to celebrate every auspicious occasion. If their holidays were not sufficiently numerous, they invented others of national or secular significance. In the second place, the motions of nature went on, confronting man with clearly marked periods of specialized industry. Festive days became symbolic, therefore, of the natural labors of the year, which required perpetual thoughtfulness and care. We know, for example, that in farming communities, each phase of the year was an excuse for dances, parties, family gatherings, and community assemblies. The subconscious impulse to rejoice or to be thankful could not be suppressed, especially in those long centuries when other forms of entertainment were comparatively unknown. From a drawing by Tura, The Rabbit in the Moon. In the Chinese legends, the lunar rabbit is working with a mortar and pestle, mixing the medicine of universal life. In the Japanese account, he is more practically employed grinding rice, which in that country is the staff of life. If, therefore, Christianity now celebrates the universal spring festival under the name of Easter, it binds together many of the most beautiful and significant of pre-Christian rites. The determination of the exact date of the Christian Easter has always included two vital elements of calculation: the sun and the moon. In most of the religious systems of the ancient world, the egg was a solar symbol and was also representative of generation, the chick breaking through its shell being likened to the victory of the sun over the limitation of winter. In a sense, the shell could also be regarded as a tomb or grave from which life burst forth. The rabbit was universally regarded as a lunar symbol. It is associated with propagation, thus standing for annual increase in the animal kingdom. Early naturalists also held the opinion that the rabbit was androgynous, and this popular belief further contributed to the fecundity concept associated with this animal. In terms of comparative religion, The custom of giving or exchanging eggs at the vernal equinox can be traced in the theologies and philosophies of the Egyptians, Persians, Druids, Greeks, and Romans. Among all these cultures, the egg was an emblem of the universe. One writer notes that eggs were held by the Egyptians as sacred emblems of the renovation of mankind after the universal deluge. On this theme, James Bonwick writes in his Egyptian Belief and Modern Thought, eggs were hung up in the Egyptian temples. Bunsen calls attention to the mundane egg, the emblem of generative life, proceeding from the mouth of the great god of Egypt. The mystic egg of Babylon, hatching the Venus Ishtar, fell from heaven to the Euphrates. Dyed eggs were sacred Easter offerings in Egypt, as they are still in China and Europe. Easter, or spring, was the season of birth, terrestrial and celestial. Eggs were also used by the Jews in the Feast of the Passover, together with the Paschal lamb. They may have adopted this symbolism as representative of their departure from Egypt and their entrance into a new life. From Over Paschalia Sacro Emblemate, the world egg. The Venerable Bede tells us that the rabbit was sacred to Ostara, which may explain its inclusion among the symbols associated with early European Christianity. What we now call the familiar Easter bunny was venerated in Egypt and Assyria, and also among the Druids of Britain. As a lunar symbol, it was honored by the Trojans, and in Sicily, medals were struck in its honor. Eros, the god of love, is sometimes depicted carrying a rabbit, and it has been associated with the story of Proserpine and her descent into the underworld. It was sacred to Osiris and was anciently a symbol of the Logos. In its association with the moon, it appears among the early manuscripts of the Aztecs of Mexico and in the cosmological diagrams of the Japanese and Chinese. Although we have advanced civilization in many respects, we have not outgrown the need to be reminded of our relationship with the divine power which sustains all things. On Easter Sunday, it is traditional that we should put on new clothes, or at least wear the best of our available garments. Much is made of the Easter bonnet, traditionally a headgear ornamented with flowers, perhaps originally a wreath fashioned from the first green sprigs of the year. We wear this finery to church and then parade on the principal streets of our cities or towns. We are simply telling all who gaze upon our festive habiliments that spring has come. As we deck our bodies, so the earth shall become beautiful. Not only this, but the climate will be warmer and more pleasant. The heavy storms will pass, the snows will melt, and the gods of winter will depart to their desolate northern region. The sun has slain the spirit of darkness as St. George slew the dragon. Winter has returned to his cavern, and the goddess of spring has been liberated from the underworld. To the devout Christian, the resurrection of Christ symbolizes the restoration of love, truth, and beauty. When the stone in the garden was rolled away and the Master first came forth, he met Mary Magdalene, who had come to pay homage at the tomb. She did not recognize Jesus at first, because he had the appearance of a gardener with a spade in his hand. This is another reference to the ancient rites of turning the earth and preparing the land for the sowing of the seed. This was possible only when the spring thaw had softened the soil, and when there was no longer danger that the stirring seedlings would be destroyed by late frost. From The Small Passion by Albrecht Dürer. Christ, as the gardener, appearing to Mary Magdalene after the resurrection. It should not be assumed that this natural symbolism exhausted itself in the physical activities of humanity. All exterior things are but signs of invisible truths and principles. The restoration of nature was always mystically contemplated. Man sought to apply the occurrences around him to his own internal life, realizing that he likewise had his spring, summer, autumn, and winter. The cycle of the year came to represent the cycle of his own existence: infancy, youth, maturity, and age. With these mutations of his own life, he was required to become familiar. He had to face all changes with a good hope and reconcile his ambition with the destiny of his body. He had to face the decrepitude of the years and the final transition at his winter solstice from this mortal state to an unknown region which lay beyond. He struggled for countless ages with the mystery of death, until finally the realization of immortality gave him a wonderful consolation of spirit. It was still true that he came forth as a flower and was cut down. it might still be true that the earth should know him no more. But he passed not into darkness, but into another life where he lived and continued, and where his consciousness, released from the prison of earth, was united with his God. The annual victory of the sun god, rising triumphantly from the darkness of winter, became a promise of a universal resurrection, a sign in the heavens of God's love, watchfulness and care, an annual testimony to the divine mercy and compassion. In this way, simple signs and omens, promises and testimonies strengthened the inner resolution and made possible the spiritualizing of man's faiths and beliefs, and the final victory of the concept of immortality over all lesser convictions and opinions. The celebration of Easter, often called Queen of Festivals, is universal among Christian people. It consummates the period of Lent, which begins with Ash Wednesday and terminates with Easter Sunday. The last week of Lent begins with Palm Sunday, which is followed by Maundy Thursday and Good Friday. Lent is essentially a period of fasting and penance during which the devout Christian purifies his body, heart and mind for the mystical experience of spiritual resurrection. Palm Sunday marks the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, together with his disciples, for the celebration of the Jewish Passover. Maundy Thursday commemorates the Last Supper, the establishment of the sacrament of the Eucharist, and the departure of the disciples. On this day, high officials of the Church wash the feet of the poor in fulfillment of John 13:5 and 14. Good Friday is the anniversary of the crucifixion of Christ. The solemnity of these events precluded any spirit of frivolity, such as has accumulated around other holidays. Easter Sunday, however, marking the resurrection of the crucified Messiah, was distinguished by an attitude of spiritual exaltation. As Jesus came to Jerusalem to keep the Jewish Passover, it is obvious that the Passover coincided very closely with what we now call the Christian Easter. Among Orthodox Jews, the Passover, Pesach, marks the deliverance of the Hebrews from Egypt and includes the sacrifice of the Paschal Lamb, according to the authority of the 12th chapter of Exodus. In the original Syrian Christian communities, it was considered quite proper that the Jewish and Christian celebrations should be held at the same time, but as the temporal power of Christianity increased, it was decided that they should no longer fall together. At the Council of Nicaea, AD 325, the Emperor Constantine convinced the assembled delegates that the great feast of Easter should be set beyond all possible future dispute. At his insistence, specific rules for calculating Easter were adopted. It was established that the 21st day of March should be accounted the vernal equinox, that the full moon happening upon or next after the 21st of March should be taken for the full moon of Nisan, that the Lord's Day next following that full moon should be Easter Day, but that if that full moon happened upon a Sunday, Easter should be the Sunday following. This precluded the possibility of the date coinciding with the Jewish Passover. In many respects, the Passover is also a regeneration or resurrection festival. Egypt signified a land of darkness and could appropriately stand for winter. It could also be related to the equinomial mystery, the passing over of the sun into the northern hemisphere, bringing back light and fertility to the earth. This light is indeed the life of all things that have an existence in nature. With the coming of spring, men passed from a state of scarcity toward a condition of abundance, even as the Israelites wandering in the wilderness came finally to the promised land which flowed with milk and honey. Kedrinus, the Greek historian circa 1100 AD, considerably enlarges the significance of Easter in his summary of the Christian beliefs of his time. The first day of the first month is the first of the month, Nisan, which corresponds to the 25th of March of the Romans and with the Egyptian month Faminoth. On that day, Gabriel gave the salutation to Mary to conceive the Savior. On that same day, our Savior God, after having finished his career, rose again from the dead, which our ancient fathers called the Pascha, or Passage of the Lord. It is on this same day of the month of March that our theologians fix the return or the second advent of this Savior God, which is the time when the general judgment is to take place, the new era having necessarily to run from that equinoctial period, because it is on that same day that God originally created heaven, earth, wind, and light. It should be pointed out that among the Romans, the festival of the vernal equinox, or the transit of the sun, was originally fixed on the 8th day before the calends of April, or exactly 3 months day for day, from the winter solstice, which took place on the 8th day before the calends of January. It is in the Pauline epistles that the mystical aspect of Christianity is first clearly enunciated. To Paul, Christ was a manifestation of the redeeming power of God, an embodiment of universal love and the Savior of the world. It remained for the Alexandrian Gnostics to enlarge this idea, to sustain it with philosophy, and to so expand the Christology of Paul that resurrection came to mean the victory of the divine over the human, collectively and individually. Most modern schools of Christian mysticism are indebted to the Gnosis for the esoteric implications of the mission of Christ. Building from the foundations of both the Old and New Testaments, these Egyptian visionaries divided Christianity into a twofold religion, the parts of which may be termed historical Christianity and mystical Christianity. Once the internal or mystical part came to be understood, all the symbols and allegories of the Gospels and Epistles took on a new and more splendid meaning. Christ on the cross bled from 7 wounds and his blood fell onto the earth. This was the blood of atonement, by which the regions of the earth and all the creatures inhabiting them received into themselves the cleansing blood of Golgotha. By this mystery, Christ entered into the world and into the hearts and lives of mortals. He became an indwelling spirit, the living sacrifice for the sins of men. Having thus descended into the death of matter, the Messiah is made to say, "Lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world." It is thus that the only begotten Son of the eternal Father, as the redeeming power of God, became obscured and descended into the underworld to redeem the souls of the dead. In this way, the inward life of man, his spiritual integrity, was reinforced by the mercy of God, so that each human being had a new spiritual resource, impelling him to the good and ensuring for those who believed and accepted this mystery a new hope of redemption. The Gnosis went on by implication to point out that the resurrection of Christ is therefore the liberation of the Messiah from the dark tomb of mortality. This resurrection becomes the universal symbol of the restoration of the love of God and is accomplished in the personal life of the true believer. To the degree that man becomes aware of this mystery, he accepts the responsibility for the liberation of the Christ in himself. A Christian technically is therefore one who has accepted the reality of the Christian mystery and dedicates his life to the service of the Christ in himself, which is his hope of glory. This concept is very close to that of the Neoplatonists, who also held that the Logos, the revealed power of God, took upon itself flesh, concealing its divinity beneath the innumerable forms of nature. This Logos is the seed which falls into the earth and lies buried there, awaiting the day of resurrection. Bamy, who was strongly inspired by the earlier Christian mystics, held that Christ, in the form of the seed of the new life, is sown in the human heart, where it takes up its abode amidst the beasts of the animal nature, symbolized by the stable of the Nativity. By the light of reason and the warmth of faith, the seed of Christ is caused to germinate and to send forth the first green shoot which heralds the redemption of the soul. If man from his life and his deeds would nourish the seed of Christ, the tree of life would grow in him, becoming a shelter against the evils of the world. Through ecstasy and visions, man may come to know the mystery of his own soul, that he is saved not by his own works alone, but by the power of God within, for it is the Father through the Son that doeth the works. By this mystery, men are also inspired to humility and to continuing gratitude for the gift of their salvation. Yet they are also held firm by a code of conduct, for they must worship through obedience. If they would know the doctrine, they must live the life. If corruption takes possession of their hearts and minds, the seed of the soul cannot be nourished, and the young sprig will be destroyed as though by an early frost. The Gnostics affirmed that this doctrine is clearly indicated in the Pauline epistles and in the Apocalypse of St. John. In this way, the divine power becomes, in a strange way, the very servant of man and the continuing victim of human delinquency. If, however, universal life in the form of the blood of Christ augments the natural life abiding in the human spirit, man is given power to work the miracle of faith. He may fulfill the injunction given by Jesus to his disciples that they should go forth and perform wonders in his name. Christianity, in its more mystical aspects, has taken this concept as a proof of its uniqueness, and as a justification for affirming that only those who accept the ministry of Christ can hope for redemption. This, however, falls short of the original meaning, for the Christ of St. Paul is a cosmic being belonging neither to one faith nor to another, the principle of divine love itself. It is therefore appropriate to think of the universal Messiah as a principle, a quality present everywhere in the nature of God and in that creation which lives and moves and has its being in God. Most religions also have their mystical sects which teach the universal mystery. Love, faith, and good works belong not to creeds alone, but reside in the hearts of good and dedicated persons, regardless of their nations, their races, or their times. By extension, therefore, Christ becomes the symbol of truth eternal and the redeemer of all error in all the eons of the Gnostic universe. Everywhere we find intimations of a doctrine which affirms that deity, in the process of creation, entered into his own works and productions to become one with them. Life not only overshadows form, it ensouls form. And this ensouling power by which things not only live, but are moved continuously toward conscious union with their own source, is a spirit immanent and indwelling. This is also intimated in the sacrament of the Eucharist, during which men partake of the flesh and blood of the blessed God. Wherever men seek for life, they must discover it through the numerous forms with which it is invested. Life apart from form we cannot experience, for even light is itself a form, visible to us because it is reflected in the atmosphere. Thus, we have everywhere and in all times the story of the dying God, whose holy sepulchre is creation. The universe is the tomb of the universal Creator. Man's body is a smaller tomb, but the analogy holds true everywhere in the scheme of things. The victory of indwelling life over its environment is properly represented by the rolling away of the stone on Easter morn. The resurrection is the fulfillment of the incarnation. The spirit strives to escape, producing the long and wonderful process of natural evolution. In one of the logia, or non-canonical sayings of Jesus, the Messiah says that he will come again when the inside is like the outside and the outside is like the inside. The implication is obvious. When the outer life of man bears witness through similitude to the spirit inhabiting it, that spirit is freed to reveal itself through its works. From the Large Passion by Albrecht Dürer, The Resurrection of Christ. As the rainbow was a covenant set up by God as a promise to Noah that the world would not again be destroyed by a deluge, so the vernal equinox is also a covenant that man shall not perish in the winter of his ignorance, but shall have a new birth in light and hope. The sprouting greenery is God's revelation of himself in the springtime of the year. It is the eternal proof that the earth shall be fruitful. And this fruitfulness is the divine life bursting through matter to clothe the hills and valleys with the happy vestments of spring. It is believed that Muhammad was inspired to set aside the month of Ramadan, during which no food could be eaten between dawn and sunset, by the example of the Christian Lent. During the month of Ramadan, according to the teachings of the Prophet, the doors of heaven or paradise are open, and the doors of hell are shut, and all the demons are chained. Among the Islamic mystics, this concept is also interpreted to represent a period set aside for the contemplation of holiness and the purification of the body as acts of worship, honoring the divine principle in the universe and in the human soul. The essential meaning of Lent emphasizes the importance of self-discipline and cleansing the nature of all impurity, moral or physical, in preparation for a new life of spiritual and moral endeavor. Spring has always been regarded as the season most appropriate for this process of purification. We have inherited from the past the ritual of the spring house cleaning, in which the home is prepared for a new year of habitation. Our ancestors also gathered herbs and brewed teas to cleanse the body of its impurities. There were spring tonics to strengthen man for the labors of agriculture and commerce. Although most of these survived from the belief that the year began at Easter, they still are most appropriate to the idea of regeneration. It is right and proper that we should meet the opportunities of the future with refreshed minds, harmonized emotions, and a healthy body. Purification, therefore, implies release from old grudges, liberation from prejudices and false opinions which burden the future. At this season, we should be especially thoughtful and rededicate ourselves to the realization of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. We should quietly resolve to love one another, thus keeping faith with the universal light that has so magnificently revealed itself to our wondering eyes. Many folks keep the physical rules of Lent as they have continued down the centuries, but all outward rites and ceremonies are only shadowy symbols of inward and eternal truths. We serve the universal spirit within ourselves when we make glorious the house in which it dwells. Thus, worship is actually the keeping of the commandments, which prepares us for a new experience of peace and understanding. When we put our own house in order, freeing the consciousness within us from its burden of faults and unworthy attitudes, we attain a new serenity and a wonderful sense of personal security. In the quietude of our own ordered and regenerated living, we are capable of accepting the fullness of the Easter mystery. Through our dedicated lives comes a release of universal energy, impelling us to live closer to the best of our own ideals and convictions. There is a restoration of inner values, a regeneration of mental and emotional processes, and a resurrection of spiritual grace. Strengthened by these resources which we have earned through the rededication of our total being, we may be assured that the coming year will bring a good harvest. The seeds of good deeds will be made fertile, and the earth will become beautiful with peace and tranquility. Matter and materialism are not the same thing. Matter is a substance, the earth from which grows the diversified beauty of plants and shrubs and trees. It is the proper soil necessary to the protection and nutrition of life. Materialism is the attitude toward both matter and the condition of man. To the idealist, matter is the fruitful womb forever bearing life, but to the materialist, matter is a kind of sterile tomb into which things die without hope. To the mystic, there can be no death, for life itself cannot die. Through the long mystery of winter, nature is not dead, but it sleeps. And in the spring, the tomb gives up its dead as the firstborn of those that sleep. The miracle of resurrection is ever near to us if we open ourselves to receive its promise. No matter what may go wrong or how dismal our fate may seem, we live in a world of everlasting life. And our own understanding, our gracious acceptance, and our continual watchfulness not only reveal the hope of a better spring, but the certainty of a restoration. Our dreams can come true, for in the universe in which we live, death is swallowed up in life, darkness is full of light, and heaven is everywhere. One of the old mystics said that the fields and flowers reflect a heaven full of stars, and the fruitfulness of God flowing from space is met by the fruitfulness of the earth, rising up to meet its Creator. These are Easter truths which can help us every day to regain the faith we have lost and keep the faith we have. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.